History Department from 2003 to 2017. We miss Bruce for all kinds of reasons, but when Putin launched this terrible assault on Ukraine last month, we had one more reason to wish that Bruce were still here to talk to us and our students, because as our resident Eastern Europe expert, he always had deep insight and good stories about what was going on in that region, and we wanted desperately to pick his brains. Bruce taught courses here in the history of Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union, and modern warfare, all of which make him really well qualified to talk about the present crisis in Ukraine and what led to it. As a lot of you know, Bruce has also become a successful sports historian in the meantime. His latest book is The Fastest Game in the World, Hockey and the Globalization of Sports. And he's been writing a lot lately about the intersection of Russian culture and sports. If you haven't seen his recent editorial for CNN on Putin's manipulation of Russian athletics, you should go read it. It's timely and insightful. And it added the term sport. That's all from me. So Bruce, welcome and take it away.
All right. Thank you. Kate, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. All right. Then one person can hear me. So it's good to be back in a way at Calvin virtually, and to see, I can't see too many faces, but I saw plenty of familiar names pop up as you were streaming in from the lobby. So welcome, and thanks for coming out, so to speak, to my talk tonight. So what I want to do is, since I'm a historian and this is being sponsored by the Department of Historical Studies, is to give some historical background to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is necessary to look at the historical background for a couple of reasons. One reason is that many Americans are just completely unaware of Ukraine. They might not have been able to locate Ukraine on a map prior to a couple weeks ago, even though Ukraine has been independent now for 30 years. So we don't know the geography, many of us don't know the history, and this is part of a larger region of the world, Eastern Europe, that we in the West, specifically in the United States, have typically dismissed. We can't pronounce the names of the people, of the places, and so generally we put it in an area of our brain where we don't tend to bother with Eastern Europe or think about it a lot. So tonight I want to give a primer on this history behind Ukraine and its conflict with Russia. The other reason why it's important to talk about the historical background is because Vladimir Putin cited history in his speech before declaring war on Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. Excuse me, he made claims about Ukraine's right to statehood, even its claim to exist as a nation. So what I want to do is to talk about what Putin said in that speech and to counter his points, his arguments, with what we know from history about the history of the Ukrainian nation. And I'm going to structure my talk tonight around some of the points that Putin made in his speech. So first of all, I saw a number of familiar names, folk who know me already. I also saw plenty of unfamiliar names. So to give a bit of an introduction and explain some of my background on this, as Kate said, I used to teach in the history department, then called the history department at Calvin. Before that, I was the assistant director of the Center for Russian and East European Studies at the University of Kansas. I served in that role for 4 years. And Kansas, KU, is one of the few universities in the country that has a Ukrainian studies program and teaches Ukrainian language. And while I was there, I worked with students who would go overseas to the university in Lviv in Western Ukraine every summer for the Ukrainian studies program. Excuse me, we had close ties with the university in Lviv, so we regularly had Ukrainian scholars on campus. We would also have NGO workers, government analysts, US government analysts and diplomats, and US military officers who worked on Ukrainian issues. So during my time at KU, we had very close ties with Ukraine, and we were one of the few universities in the country that had this kind of connection with Ukraine. During this time, when I was at KU, my next door neighbor, my office neighbor, was the professor in charge of the Ukrainian studies program. He was originally from Lviv, so he studied, was educated in Soviet Ukraine. And his name was Alex Tsyov, and unfortunately he passed away about 8 years ago in a car accident. But Alex was this wonderfully engaging person. He was just gregarious, lively. When he came into my office, I knew he would be there for a while, and it would just be a fun, enriching conversation. He was, in addition to being a scholar and a terrific teacher, he also moonlighted as a State Department translator. So whenever there was an official delegation that came from Ukraine to Washington, D.C., Alex would go out and do translations between those figures and people in the government and so forth. So I learned a lot from Alex about Ukraine. I learned a lot from him about life in the Soviet Union. My former students who had classes with me on the history of Russia or the Soviet Union or communism or Eastern Europe, they will know stories that I told, which were passed along to me from Alex. When this war began, I asked a mutual friend of ours, someone who had been very close to Alex, if she knew this was coming, this conflict. And she herself is of Ukrainian ancestry and is a scholar of Russia and Eastern Europe. And she said that she and Alex used to talk about this quite a bit. And she said, Alex knew it was inevitable. Keep going. I understood the deep divide between Russia and Ukraine. I knew of the currents in Russian culture and politics that led to Putin and to this war. I knew these things on an abstract level, but I never thought a war between Russia and Ukraine would happen. And I think I'm like a lot of Russian observers and students of Russia who would say something like, yes, the signs were always there. The signs were evident in Russia's history, in Putin's view of the world that he would explain in hints here and there. But I never thought that he would actually act on it. I never thought that those signs would come together and lead us to this type of conflict. And in fact, you know, many of my former students who will here remember that when I used to teach Russian history, we would have a lot of fun. We had a lot of laughs. So many of you have seen the photos of Putin shirtless on horseback or out fishing, or the memes that then resulted of, you know, Putin riding great white sharks and so forth. And my students and I had a lot of fun with that back when I was teaching Russian history. But now, of course, we don't laugh so much about Putin. So this is my admission to start, that despite teaching the history of this region for years, for 2 decades, I did not think this would happen. Unlike my dear late colleague Alex, who thought that this war was inevitable. So let's look at Putin and what he said about Ukraine and see what we can learn from history. So I'm going to share my screen. We'll see if this comes up. So.
It's working.
All right, so you can see me?
Yes, we can.
And you can see a quote from Putin. So this is from his speech right before the start of the invasion a couple weeks ago. So Putin said, I would like to emphasize again that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us, for Russia. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. All right, so what does Putin mean by this, and how is he wrong? And he is wrong. So the first part, what does he mean by this? An inalienable part of our history, culture, and spiritual space. So the oldest state in the Eastern Slav lands, going back to the medieval period, was based in the present-day city of Kyiv. So Kyiv is the Ukrainian name for the city that many of us, my age and above, will remember as Kiev, the Russian name. So by the 10th century, the vast realm of the Principality of Kiev, or Kievan Rus, as it was also called, dominated much of the territory of the Eastern Slavic peoples. So this was ruled by the Prince of Kiev. Kiev had links with the major kingdoms of Europe. There were lucrative trade routes that connected Kiev to the West. Daughters of Kievan princes were married to nobles in Europe. Kiev also had links, excuse me, with the Vikings in the north and down to the south to the Byzantine Empire. And in fact, it was from the south, from the Byzantine Empire, where Christianity first came into the Eastern Slav lands in the year 988. Okay? So this was the first major state in the Eastern Slav lands with connections both to Western Europe to the north as well as to the Byzantine Empire. We see the evidence of how wealthy this and advanced this state was, this civilization was, from the churches that we still see in Kiev today that date back to the time of Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus was conquered in the 1200s by the Mongols. It became part of the vast Mongol Empire that stretched across Eurasia. And in the centuries that followed, this area that had been the center of the Eastern Slav lands became more of a peripheral region. So Kiev had been a great city, the dominant city in this region, but over the centuries, power shifted. And I'll switch to another map here showing Europe in the 1600s. So we're jumping quickly through the centuries. So power shifted over the centuries, excuse me. In the south, the Ottoman Empire came to dominate the area around the Black Sea. In the west, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, so you see there in blue, dominated much of present-day Eastern Europe. Okay? And then in the east, in the northeast, the state of Muscovy, based at the city of Moscow, grew in power and territory throughout the 1400s and the 1500s. Okay? So the territory of Ukraine throughout this time is going to be divided among these principal states as well as other kingdoms and empires. Okay? The territory of Ukraine is divided up, and this area, once the center of power in the Eastern Slav lands, will become a peripheral region that provides resources. So it provides wheat for Poland, for Muscovy, and in particular for the Ottoman Empire. And Ukraine will also provide slaves, principally to the Ottoman Empire. Somewhere in the area of about 10,000 slaves a year were taken from the territory of present-day Ukraine and brought into the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so this is when looking at Putin's claim that Ukraine was always part of Russia. Really, Ukraine has been part of many different kingdoms and states and empires throughout its history. Okay, and it's important to note what Ukraine is, and you get a sense of this in looking at this particular map. Ukraine is the word Ukraine means on the borderland. Okay, so this region has not always been an integral part of Russia. Instead, it has been on the border between the Russian state, the Russian Imperium, and other states. It was only in the late 1700s, so you see that purple area of the Ottoman Empire along the north shore of the Black Sea. It's only in the late 1700s during the reign of Catherine the Great that this territory was taken over by Russia. And the western lands of Ukraine, and I'm going to jump ahead to the next map. So again, we jump ahead centuries. The western lands of Ukraine became part of the Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary. Okay, so even though we just made a jump of some 3 centuries, you see that Ukraine is still in something of a similar situation. It's on the border. It's divided up between 2 large empires: the Russian Empire, the Romanov Empire, and then the Habsburg Empire to the west. And if you look closely at that map, you'll recognize some of the cities that are in the news today. So Kiev, there right in the middle on the right-hand side is, of course, Kyiv. The dark text city on the far right of the map, Kharkov, is the city of Kharkiv, the city that's come under bombardment and that has fallen to the Russian military during the invasion. And then if you follow that line of latitude from Kharkiv over to the west, crossing the pink boundary into Austria-Hungary, you come to the city of Lemberg. Lemberg is the present-day city of Lviv, the most important city in western Ukraine. And then down to the southeast from Lemberg, you see the city of Chernivtsi, That's also a Ukrainian city today, Chernivtsi. So this territory, mainly the areas in green, but also some territory in pink, constitutes the present-day region of Ukraine. So the fact that Ukraine was split between different empires, between the Russian Empire and its neighbors for centuries, is important because Ukraine has always been something of the conduit for ideas and for goods from Europe into Russia. So at one point, Kiev was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You see that Lemberg or Lviv was part of the Habsburg Empire. So these were areas where you had West European style academies and schools. These were cities that were part of the cultural West, you could say. So it's through these areas, through Lviv and through Kiev, where West European ideas began to come into Russia, and cultural historians have documented how these did have an effect within the Russian Empire. So just as today, where Putin fears Ukraine as a foothold of European ideas and democracy coming into Russia, this is the role that Ukraine has played throughout much of this region's history, where it has been this boundary area, this bridge between Russia and the West, and has served as the avenue by which ideas have come into Russia. Okay. All right, let's move ahead to the next quote from Putin, from his speech before the start of the war. So modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or to be more precise, by Bolshevik communist Russia. This process started practically right after the 1917 revolution, and Lenin and his associates did it in a way that was extremely harsh on Russia by severing what is historically Russian land. Nobody asked the millions of people living there what they thought. And that's a great line there. You should note that. Putin claiming to care about the self-determination of millions of people. So not only is that a stretch for Putin to claim he cares about something like democracy, but it's also bad history. So the idea that Ukraine was created in 1917 by the communists is false. Already in the 1800s, there was something like a Ukrainian national movement. And like national movements among other groups in Central and Eastern Europe without their own sovereign states, this was a movement that was led mainly by academics and writers and poets. So one person you might hear about or read about in coverage of Ukraine today is the person who's regarded as one of the national heroes of Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko. Shevchenko was a poet, an artist. He was something of an ethnographer, anthropologist. And Shevchenko is representative of the kind of work that other nation builders, if we can call them that, nation builders in Ukraine and throughout the region in the 19th century did. He wrote poetry, he collected folk stories. These nation builders, they wrote grammars, they wrote dictionaries. They didn't invent the languages. The Ukrainian language had been in existence going back to the time of Kievan Rus, but Ukrainian, unlike Russian, was principally a language of the villages. It was the language of the peasants. And so the work that Shevchenko and other people of the 19th century did is they took this spoken language of the people and put it into literature, which is why they're so revered today. And you see, this is a statue of Shevchenko in the center of Kyiv. So Shevchenko and others gave definition to the Ukrainian language, and they began to help define the sense of a distinct Ukrainian identity. So now, rather than Russia creating Ukraine or creating Ukrainians, Russia has repeatedly tried to suppress the Ukrainians. Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, and Ukrainian identity. Shevchenko himself was arrested by the Tsar and sent into exile because of what he wrote in Ukrainian. And it should be noted, the Tsar could read Ukrainian. and he understood it and appreciated, and then he realized, no, we can't have somebody writing in Ukrainian. There's the potential for political problems, for unrest. So Shevchenko was arrested. Ukrainian schools were closed in the 1800s. Publications in Ukrainian were banned. The Tsar's head of police said there has never been, is not, and never can be a separate Little Russian language. And this is the term that the Russians, or the Great Russians, called the Ukrainians. They were the Little Russians. The Belarusians were the White Russians. So once again, to underline this claim that the Ukrainians are an essential part of the Russian nation. So you had repression in Tsarist Russia during the 1800s and into the early 20th century. Meanwhile, in the western part of Ukraine, within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the government did allow for schools in Ukrainian and for publications in Ukrainian. So you have this developing Ukrainian national movement in the western part of the Ukrainian lands living under Habsburg rule. In both areas, in Russian-ruled Ukraine as well as Habsburg-ruled Ukraine, you do have the beginnings of a Ukrainian national movement, the idea that there should be an independent Ukraine. So when World War I comes in 1914, and then the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and the Bolshevik Revolution basically just breaks Russia apart, or the Russian Empire, it's not Lenin and the Bolsheviks who create Ukraine, it's the Ukrainians. In the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, Ukrainians in Kiev and Ukrainians in Lviv declare independent republics, two different republics. And you get, there's different shades there. They're both rendered in green, but there was the Ukrainian People's Republic, or the Ukrainian National Republic, in dark green, and then the smaller state to the left in lighter green, the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. So both of these independent states were short-lived. They were both created in 1918. The West Ukrainian People's Republic, the smaller one, only lasted a few months before it was taken over by Poland, by independent Poland. The larger state, the larger Ukrainian Republic, basically that was subsumed by the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. So for a brief time after World War I, you do have the Ukrainians themselves creating independent Ukrainian states. As a result of the peace treaties and the conference in Paris at the end of World War I, the Ukrainians were left without a state. And this was not a decision made by diplomats. This was a recognition of what happened on the ground in the region as a result of armies fighting. And essentially both the independent Polish army and the Red Army, the army of Bolshevik Russia, they were the ones to determine who would rule over this region, and the peace conference simply certified the boundaries in this area. So at the end of World War I and its aftermath, the Ukrainians were left without a state. And this is significant because after the Poles, the Ukrainians were the largest ethnic group in this region of Europe. And after World War I, the war supposedly for self-determination of nations, the Ukrainians are a nation without a state. And this is particularly unfortunate given that the Ukrainians suffered horribly during World War I and its aftermath. The front lines on the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Russians, much of it went through Ukraine. So there was a lot of fighting in this region during the war. And then in the aftermath, you had fighting among these different competing groups for power in the region. There were epidemics, there was famine. Additional fighting, and it's estimated that 1.5 million Ukrainians died both during the war and in the years after the First World War. So as a result of this, and I'm going to put up another map, this is a somewhat misleading map in that it shows ethnic groups across Central and Eastern Europe right before World War I. The boundaries you see are the pre-war boundaries. It's somewhat misleading in that big block of pink represents Eastern Slavic groups. So you see the Belarusians and the Ukrainians are rendered in the same color as well as with the Russians. So the Ukrainians are not indicated as a separate nationality by color. But you do get a sense of the Ukrainians reaching across this region, across the boundary of the Habsburg Empire and the Russian Empire. And then the result after the war is that they'll still be split across two states. Okay. So the bulk of the Ukrainian population will be within the Soviet Union, and then you'll also have large Ukrainian population as a minority within the independent Polish Republic created after World War I. So you can see on that map there down in the corner in the yellow, Lemberg. So Lemberg becomes in Poland the Polish city of Lwów. But this area surrounding Lemberg or Lwów is mainly populated by Ukrainians. The Russians, or I should say the Bolsheviks, do create a separate administrative space, a republic within the Soviet Union. So this is the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So ostensibly, there is a measure of autonomy in certain affairs within the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. During the 1920s, the Ukrainians were given a great deal of freedom in terms of creating schools, in terms of administration and culture. But then during the 1930s, which I'll talk about in a second, this period of greater autonomy for the Ukrainians will come to an end. So the key lesson here is that the Ukrainians historically have had really two opponents in their struggle for political sovereignty, both the Russians and the Poles. And so it's particularly important in recognizing that because the Poles today have been, as we've seen in the news, have been welcoming Ukrainian refugees. As of today, 1.7 million Ukrainians have found refuge. And for me especially, I find that particularly poignant and encouraging, given that even in the direct aftermath of World War II, there was violence between Ukrainians and Poles in contested areas. Okay. All right, let's move on to another quote from Putin. Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. So again, making the case that the Ukrainians are not Ukrainian, but rather Russian or Little Russian. And again, Putin is wrong. Ukrainians saw themselves as distinct from the Russians as well as the Poles for centuries. Now, the interesting thing here is what makes them distinct. What defines Ukrainians? And back when I was teaching East European history, this always made for a good exercise to talk about what are the elements that go into defining a nation. When we think about what makes a nation, we might think of a people who occupy a national territory, people who have a shared political tradition, people who have a shared religion, people who have shared language. In the case of the Ukrainians, none of these elements are common among all Ukrainians: national territory, political tradition, religion, or language. As we've already seen, national territory has been divided between different or among different kingdoms and states and empires. In terms of political history, as we've seen, there's little history of independent Ukrainian states. You do have further back, the Ukrainians do take pride in the independent or sovereign Cossack states or federations that existed in the medieval and early modern period. But there has not been, with the exception of this time after World War I, anything like an independent Ukrainian state. And what about religion? Religion is, before I was a historian of sports, I was a historian of religion in Eastern Europe, and Ukraine presents one of the most interesting case studies in terms of looking at the religious history of this region. You have on the territory of Ukraine Orthodox Christians who are loyal to the Patriarch in Moscow, Orthodox Christians who are loyal to the Patriarch in Kyiv. You have Roman Catholics, and you have Greek Catholics. In addition, there are Protestant, traditional Protestant churches such as Baptists. There has been a remarkable evangelical movement in independent Ukraine in the last 30 years. And then, of course, you have a large Jewish population in Ukraine. So there are a variety of different, remarkable diversity in terms of religion. And so you don't have, unlike what Putin says here, that Russians are defined by Orthodox Christianity, you have a great diversity in terms of religion throughout Ukraine. What about language? Okay, this is also a complicated issue. So as we were just talking about, in the 19th century in the Russian Empire, the Ukrainian language was suppressed. In the 1920s, you have this brief period in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic where you have Ukrainian schools and publications. But then when Stalin comes to power in the 1930s, this cultural autonomy within Soviet Ukraine is brutally repressed. Under Stalin, there was a purge, the arrests and executions of Ukrainian writers and cultural figures. And then after Stalin's death in 1953, there were periods when Ukrainian language was encouraged, and periods again when it was not suppressed to the same extent as it was under Stalin, but definitely put into a second rank below Russian. And this is important that you have these periods of ups and downs for basically the fate of the Ukrainian language. And this is the case, I should note, in central and eastern Ukraine. So the territory that had been part of the Russian Empire and part of the Soviet Union up until the end of the Second World War. In Western Ukraine, in contrast, during the Habsburg period, Ukrainian developed as a language, but under the Poles did crack down on Ukrainian schools and Ukrainian publications. Okay, so all of this with language is important because in the case of Ukraine, language does not equal nationality. Language does not equal identity. Okay, so to give you some numbers, in the last census that was conducted in Ukraine, the 2001 census, 68% of the country's population indicated that Ukrainian was their native language, okay? Whereas 29% said their native language was Russian. In terms of ethnicity, though, and this is interesting, 78% of people on the census identified themselves as being ethnically Ukrainian, whereas only 17% identified themselves as ethnically Russian. So you do have a number of Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, who indicate that their native language is Russian. So within Ukraine, you will have Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Russians, and Ukrainian-speaking Russians. Okay? All of whom recognize Ukraine, with small exception, all of whom recognize Ukraine as their state. Okay? So none of the elements that we typically associate with being the key ingredients in a nation, national territory, political history, religion, language, none of these are common among the people across Ukraine. A key element, though, of Ukrainian national identity is the fact that their neighbors, these large surrounding neighbors whose states they've been living in, their neighbors have not viewed them, the Ukrainians, as a nation at all. And when I was, and this is key to understanding Ukrainian national identity for this reason. When I used to work at the University of Kansas, and I said we had a number of Ukrainian scholars come in and a number of North American scholars who studied Ukraine. So I heard, many lectures by these visiting scholars, and there was a noticeable theme of, this sense of these scholars having to fight for their legitimacy, having to make the case that the Ukrainians were an existing nation, that the Ukrainians had a distinct and rich culture, even that Ukrainian was a distinct language. So this is an element. I mean, I heard this in academic meetings, and this is present in Ukrainian politics, the idea that the Ukrainians must basically establish themselves as a people and defend their existence as a people. And I mean, we see this going on right now, where they're fighting a war to defend their right to exist as a nation. So in the interwar period, and looking at the Ukrainians within both Poland and Soviet Russia, we see how this takes place. Excuse me. The Ukrainians who lived within Poland had to deal with the suppression of the language, suppression of Ukrainian education. There were also attempts by the Polish government, in collaboration with the Roman Catholic Church, to convert both Greek Catholic Ukrainians as well as Orthodox Ukrainians to Catholicism. So in other words, we're going to rectify this diversity, or this strange mix of religions among the Ukrainians, and turn them into Polish-speaking Catholics, which will thus make them Polish. Okay? Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the repression under Stalin was even more harsh, even more horrific. Okay. During the 1930s, and there's two main things to address, and the first of these is key when we're wanting to understand Ukrainian identity and national identity, is the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine. So this term basically means to kill someone by starvation. This was a famine that was a mix of both climate reasons, as well as deliberate actions by Stalin's government to take food out of this region and to prevent any relief supplies from reaching areas of Ukraine where you had starvation. So this was a deliberate effort by the Soviet government under Stalin to basically to starve the Ukrainian population into submission. And you get a sense here in looking at the map of how this famine over the course of these 2 years hit different regions, whereas some of these regions in darkest red, you had over 25% of the population killed during the famine. So there are estimates that total during these 2 years, some 3.5 to 4.5 million people died of starvation in Ukraine. So the Holodomor, the terror famine, or this forced famine, was then followed immediately by the terror by Stalin's terror in Soviet Ukraine. And what that meant in the Ukraine is Stalin targeted the party leadership, the Communist Party leadership, targeted Ukrainian writers, teachers, university professors, journalists. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church was dissolved, and bishops and hundreds of priests were sent to the Gulag, to the labor camps in the Soviet Union. And this is something, for those of us who are American, this is something that we really can't comprehend, this idea of just horrific suffering as part of the national narrative, as part of the collective memory. But it's so important in understanding Ukrainian identity, particularly the famine. The famine is a subject of study in Ukrainian schools. It is memorialized. There is a holiday every year to commemorate the famine. And this is regarded by the Ukrainian people as a deliberate act of genocide carried out by the Soviet government against them. All right, another quote from Putin. "We seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine." Okay, what does this mean? What is Putin after? So this is a common denunciation of Ukrainian nationalism, or just the Ukrainian government, is that it is Nazi or fascist or anti-Semitic. And this does play upon real episodes in history. In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, there were Ukrainian communities that welcomed German troops as liberators. After years of suffering under the Soviets, the Germans were welcomed with bread and salt. in some some Ukrainian communities. The Germans were able to exploit the hostility that Ukrainians had encountered under the Poles and under the Soviets to recruit Ukrainians for police units that would principally target the Poles. The Germans also formed an SS military unit of Ukrainian recruits for fighting against the Soviets. Ukrainians were guards in extermination camps, and there were Ukrainians who were members of the firing squads that executed Jews. At the same time, far more Ukrainians joined the Red Army to fight Nazi Germany. More than 4.5 million Ukrainians served in the Soviet military, and another 250,000 served in partisan units resisting the German occupation. So these dwarf the numbers of those who collaborated with the Germans during the war. According to calculations, over 5 million Ukrainians, or according to estimates, and the numbers in terms of casualties in this region during the war are really estimates, but over 5 million Ukrainians were killed during the German occupation. Because, however, of the small Ukrainian involvement with the Nazis, current Ukrainian national movements have been tarred as Nazi. And there have also been small neo-Nazi movements in present-day Ukraine. But as President Zelensky, the grandson of Holocaust survivors, has pointed out, to call Ukraine a Nazi or a fascist state is ridiculous. And in fact, to counter Putin's claim that Ukraine is a fascist state, keep in mind that Ukraine has had open elections and transfers of power over the last 20 years, in contrast to Russia and Russia's sole ally in this war, Belarus, where you've had Alexander Lukashenko has been the president really since the 1990s. Putin, of course, served 2 terms as president, and then you see that period beginning in 1910, where the Constitution said he could not run again. So he became the prime minister while Dmitry Medvedev served 1 term as president. But as the picture indicates, throughout the span since 1999 to the present, Putin has been the power in Ukraine, or excuse me, in Russia. So this is the real threat to Putin, that Ukraine is actually a functioning democracy where there are elections and there are changes of power. And I was listening to one scholar of Ukraine say that for the most part, the leadership of Ukraine, in terms of the people who've served as president, Ukraine generally tends in a moderate direction. You've not had people of national extremes or progressive extremes and so forth. Ukrainian voters have kind of tended toward the middle. So the threat to Putin is that Ukraine will bring greater democracy rather than fascism. So then what is it that we've looked at Putin's statements about Ukrainian history, about its lack of any kind of state history or political history. It's the absence of any justification for it to exist as a separate nation, separate from the Russians. What is it that Putin wants? So Putin's image in the West, and I will admit that I subscribe to this for a time, is that he's just coldly rational. He's the supremely calculating leader, the mastermind, who is always thinking 2 steps ahead of the West. So for some reason, we've had this idea that Putin is able to play American presidents and Western leaders because he's just so canny and so strategic. And you know, thinking of him in those terms, his decision to invade Ukraine thus seems kind of surprising. He appears more irrational and appears to be acting, especially when we read speeches like I've been quoting from, he appears to act more for ideological than for strategic or political or more kind of realpolitik reasons. And indeed, Putin does have an ideology. And when I mentioned at the start of the talk that back when I was, working at the University of Kansas, we could already pick up the threads of of Putin's thinking on certain issues and the hints of an ideology. And there were scholars, some of whom were my colleagues, one who was my student and has now been, you see him regularly on CNN. He was, one of the first to discern, to put together these hints and to recognize an ideology that Putin subscribed to. Putin's ideology is called Eurasianism. Eurasianism is, the goal of it is the reconstitution of a Russian imperium. So some type of Russian imperial state that spans the Eurasian landmass. Okay. Eurasianism is based on the notion that Russian culture and identity is fundamentally different from the identity of European nations and the shared identity of Europeans. What Putin sees with Ukraine is that the Ukrainians are violating the deeper cultural ties. Okay, remember back that early quote that Putin talks about the spiritual connection, the cultural connection between the Ukrainians and Russians, and this is key. What Putin sees is that the Ukrainians are violating these deeper cultural ties that should bind all of the Eastern Slavic peoples. In the Eurasianist view, Russia and Ukraine have much in common: culture, language, religion, and ethnic similarities. The problem is, for Putin, that these similarities have been undermined since Ukraine gained its independence in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it has been Ukrainian nationalists, rather than expressing a true vision of Ukrainian identity. Instead, Ukrainian nationalists have undermined the true nature of Ukraine by promoting separation from Russia. So while people in Kyiv may be yearning to be part of Europe, Putin sees Ukraine, or at least a big chunk of it, as part of Russia, as an integral part of Russia. The problem for Ukraine and the problem for us is that this is not, Eurasianism is not an inclusive ideology. It doesn't make room for other great states, for other great cultures. Eurasianism rejects modernity. Eurasianism rejects rationalism. Eurasianism is all about personal power. It is not a people-friendly ideology, and we see this in the course of the war with Russian troops bombarding cities occupied by Russian-speaking people. So this is not a people-friendly ideology. Eurasianism does not recognize win-win solutions. It is strictly an ideology of I win only when you lose. It is an ideology built out of resentment and wanting to win over one's opponents, to beat one's opponents. The Eurasianist conception of Russia defines itself only in contrast to an enemy. And this philosophy goes back into the early 20th century, the late 19th century, and it's been characteristic through that. For some reason, Eurasianism is unable to exist. It's unable to identify itself separate by not reflecting itself in another, in an enemy, in a rival. At the present time, the enemy of Eurasianism is not Ukraine, it is the West. The enemy of Eurasianism is Europe, and it's the United States. The United States is seen as unprincipled, as concerned only with money, as undermined by diversity, as weak and decadent. Whereas Russia is patriotic, is strong, is moral, is grounded by tradition, culture, and this sense of a spiritual connection among peoples. And I'll finish by saying this. When I was first learning about Eurasianism, and now this was, 20 years ago, it seemed far-fetched, right? This seems like a pre-modern philosophy. It's like something that intellectuals would conjure up in coffee shops or something back in 19th century Europe. Would this be something that would really animate policy? Would this animate the actions of a government in the 21st century. When Putin went to war a couple weeks ago, my former students and colleagues, we recognized the patterns, the threads were there all along. And other than my former colleague, my late colleague, Alex, we never thought this would happen. Now that it has happened, I can tell you that we have to take Putin very seriously. Putin will not, if the Ukrainians hold, God willing they hold, Putin will not say, my bad, and bring his troops back to Russia. So I'll stop with that, and we can open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Can we unshare the pictures now?
Yep.
Okay. You can hear me, right?
I can hear you. Okay.
So it has come to my attention that not everyone is able to access the chat. So I've received a few questions by email, which I'll start with by pasting in the chat. And those who can use chat, please do so. And if we run out of questions that way, I can turn mics on, but I think we'll start by using chat with those who are available. If you would like to send a question and you don't know my email, you can send it to history@calvin.edu.
I think all right, I was muted. I'll ask you a question, Bruce, while I'm waiting for other questions to appear, because I don't see any yet.
Okay.
Could you say a little bit more about your sense of Russian public opinion right now? Because you've given us a beautiful picture of Ukrainian history and Ukrainian sense of nationalism. So I really appreciate that. And, you know, a pretty good sense of Putin himself, but we seem to hear so many conflicting things about the Russians. I mean, there are thousands of Russians jailed for protesting against the war. And, you know, we know about all these heroic dissidents. And yet Putin seems to have some pretty strong following for his brand of nationalism. So what's your sense of the divide there and how much power?
This is a good question. This is something I've been looking at quite a bit. So you mentioned my CNN article that I wrote, and in preparing for that, I did a lot of reading on Russian sports sites, and you do get a sense. I was reading the comments in response to articles about Russia being kicked out of the World Cup qualifiers, and the International Olympic Committee saying Russians should not participate in international events. And so it was interesting, you know, kind of gauging Russian opinion based on those comments. You did get people saying, you know, one comment was, you know, thanks, Vlad. You know, this sense of, and it got far more likes than dislikes, where there was the sense of, we've been isolated from the world, our future's been pulled out from under us, all for this war. Now, at the same time, you have, and these are sports sites, of course, you had a lot of chest thumping, you had a lot of, we don't need the rest of the world, all of these international organizations are a US-led conspiracy, and we'll just go it alone because we're Russia. And so that gives a sense of the opinions. And as I've been looking elsewhere, I follow someone on Twitter who's in a Russian-American academic who's living in a provincial city, you know, so out in the Urals. And she says out there, the local newspaper did do a poll, and they found something like 69% of the people oppose the war. Okay. I just read another article today that says on the opposite, over something like 65% support the war, but it's the war as has been presented on Russian media. And that's key because Russians are getting a very inaccurate picture of what's going on. So Putin had said before the invasion that the Russians would go into Ukraine, they would be welcomed as liberators, it would be a quick victory. So what Russians are not seeing, what we're seeing, is you know, tanks being captured, soldiers being captured, tanks being blown up. You know, so other than the few individual instances where captured Russians, right, call their parents back in Russia, The version of the war that most Russians are getting is still this very Putin's version of events is what's being presented, and that's the war they're supporting, right? Whereas once people are becoming aware as they become aware of what the real ramifications are, international isolation, the failures of the Russian military, you do see evidence that that's eroding some of the support. So my former student who I mentioned earlier, he insists that this is going to end in the streets of Moscow with something of a popular revolt that will bring down Putin. I hope that's the case. I'm not entirely confident. He's smarter than me, so I'm going to trust that we see something of a turn in that direction.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to? You can probably see the chat yourself. Do you want me to keep forwarding the questions? I'm happy to, or would you rather just pick them up yourself?
I don't think I can see the chat.
Oh well, then I'll keep going. The last one I'm going to take them out of order because the last one seems most relevant to what you're talking about now. What do you think is next for Putin? I mean, the whole question is driven by Eurasianism.
Yeah.
What do you anticipate is next for Putin, whether or not he's successful?
As I said at the end, this is not something given Putin's, Putin's a bully, right? He's a bully, and so he's not going to back out. And so I've thought all along the end is going to be that this will bring the end of Putin's presidency, or Putin ratchets up the destruction in this war to a horrific level. So I don't see a way for Putin to, we can't have a reset. We can't have a reset of relations between Russia and the West, where we go back to this idea of, oh, Putin's a responsible partner in international affairs, right? This war has exposed him for who he is, and so it will be difficult to, it will be difficult to have him engage again as a world leader. And and frankly, I think that once the weight of the sanctions hits not only Putin's circle, but the broader population, then there will be the sense of, Putin is a classic strongman, right? He's at the very top of power, and in the area I study, the area I research, sports, it's been fascinating that even people within sports organizations, they would have to say, well, we got to go find out what Putin thinks about this. So he is kind of the strong man who makes decisions in all areas of life, and he builds his support in classic strongman fashion by distributing the goods, right? If you support Putin, you're going to get fabulously rich. At a certain point, I would think that the people at the top will recognize, and people further down, our hope for loot is limited, right? Our yachts are being confiscated. We can't leave the country. We don't see a good future for us and for our children with this person still in charge. So you would hope that people would recognize this strong man isn't working for us. We're not going to get a democratic Russia. But will it be one strong man replacing this strong man? I see a mic.
Sorry, I muted. There are a lot of questions. I'll sort of go in order because the first two we've ignored so far, and that is, should Central European states be concerned about Putin and about Eurasian, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all those stans? Oh,
the Central Asian states.
Did I say European? I'm sorry, Central Asian states. Yes.
he's not a threat. Those states are already, pretty well under the under the thumb politically as well as economically to Russia. So they're not a threat like Ukraine is a threat. Ukraine is has a functioning democracy. Ukraine has been reaching out to Western institutions, and so that's the threat to Putin, right? So the one state, more in the direction of Central Asia that was a threat was Georgia, and Putin invaded Georgia in 2008, and this was at a time NATO had extended an offer to both Georgia and Ukraine to enter into a partnership agreement, and basically Putin invaded Georgia to bring that to an end.
Question from Zach Dumais, which I'm not sure I understand, but maybe Zach can unmute and clarify if you need, or maybe you understand it. He says he's wondering how Putin's military history might play into the more tactical aspects of this conflict.
All my former Warren Society students will know I'm jazzed about that question. So this is something, back when I was at KU, I used to work with U.S. military officers who did different kinds of work, liaison work with Russian military officers, and so I learned a lot about the workings of the Russian military from my students and from reading their research papers about the reforms in the Russian military. And essentially, what we're seeing today in terms of what Russia is doing in this war is what they did in Chechnya in the 1990s and at the beginning of Putin's presidency. And also, it's basically the Russians are still fighting the Battle of Berlin in 1945, where using a lot of artillery, they just will bombard cities into rubble. And they don't care who they hit. They don't care if it's Ukrainians or Russians in the city. They're just going to devastate the city and then move troops in. And this is what they did in the war in Chechnya. They just completely leveled the capital of Chechnya. Chechnya was this separatist, or this province of Russia in the Caucasus Mountains that tried to separate from Russia immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. And so Putin just basically devastated the country, sent in the military. And one of the things that we're seeing now with the Russian military are a lot of problems that were present during the Soviet period. They were present in the early years of post-Soviet Russia, and there have been reforms, but the issues just haven't been resolved, right? So this is it's a conscript army. Russian conscripts are terribly mistreated by their officers. So you have low morale. You see the same pattern with captured Russian soldiers. The Ukrainians, when they capture them, they let these soldiers call home. And we know from these phone calls that the soldiers are telling their parents, we thought we were on exercises. We didn't know we were being sent here. And this is the same thing that the Soviets did when they sent troops into Afghanistan. It's the same thing they did when they sent troops into Czechoslovakia in 1968, is to not tell their soldiers what they're doing. So you see an army that's just relying on firepower, on devastation, where there's low morale. There's poor command structure, right? We've already seen Russian generals being killed in the field. But there are a lot of Russians with a lot of equipment, and so this will be for future military historians to look at overwhelming force versus a smaller military motivated by high morale with a remarkable leader. And defending their homeland.
Yeah.
Good question.
Two questions about religion. I'll give them both to you. They're distinct, but just so you know, they're both there and you can decide which order to take them in.
Yeah.
One from Mike Abma. Is Putin trying to promote the Russian Orthodox Church swallowing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? And does he have the support of the Patriarch of Moscow in this? And the other question is about the historical Reformed Church in Ukraine and whether that is significant in Ukrainian history.
I don't know. I can't answer the second one. I know mainly about Ukrainian Baptists in terms of traditional denominations, as well as the surge of evangelical Christianity in Ukraine in the 1990s. I can't talk about the Reformed Church, sorry. But for the Orthodox Church, I just read today, and this was actually remarkable, of a group of I can't remember if it was priests or bishops who openly they issued a harsh letter saying sin has consequences, and what we're doing is wrong, and we need to stop doing this. At the same time, and I think it was the Patriarch in Moscow did speak in support of the war recently. So I don't know. I can't answer the question, Mike, about whether Putin wants to eliminate the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I do know. I read a bit about that's playing out on the ground among Orthodox Christians in terms of who are being attacked. And trying to remember where I read this article. But it is resulting in this question of where does their loyalty lie? Do they continue to remain in fidelity to the Patriarch in Moscow or to the Patriarch in Kyiv? So Putin has, throughout his presidency, he's kind of moved closer and closer to the Orthodox Church, and it has served him politically to kind of wrap himself in, basically a flag of Christian nationalism.
Yeah. Thanks. Different direction. Is
Yep.
Putin at all motivated by reclaiming the natural resources in Ukraine, like oil, or is it all just about nationalism?
You could say, in terms of natural resources, that he wants to, secure the pipelines that deliver Russian natural gas to Europe. So that would be one part of his strategy where Ukraine is key. Once again, going back to my framing comments, I think many of us who watch Russia, and this was the case with me, we always thought we thought Putin was coldly rational, right? He's a former KGB person, right? So everything is about basically hard aims, practical aims, and so this is about resources, or it's about pipelines. But yeah, I've come around to the view that when he says Ukraine as a people Ukraine as a nation belongs to Russia, there's a cultural and spiritual tie. I see that as really the driving motivation. And and I think part of it too, back to that is what we do know is that a lot of people in the upper circles were completely surprised by Putin's decision. So this wasn't something he concocted with the oligarchs to bring them more loot. This was something that he planned with a pretty small circle. And so even within the government, people were surprised by this.
Thanks. We have a few from Calvin students now that Jenna put in the chat. Delvin Fernando says, "Hi, Bruce. Thanks for your amazing lecture. Recently, Russia has put out a list of what they consider unfriendly countries. What do you think is Putin's goal with that list? Is he seeking to expand and act on his Eurasianist views to a global platform? Should we brace for a global war soon?"
Throughout this, right from the speech he gave when he declared war, he basically set down a warning, to other countries: don't get involved in this. And so yeah, by making this list of nations that are unfriendly, that's really a good question, and it is something to pay attention to, because in the lead up to the war with Ukraine, Putin did try to create a cause for war, right? A legitimate cause for war. It was completely concocted. Nobody believed it, in large part because the United States had intelligence that he was planning the war. And so, he was trying to create incidents in the Donbass and so forth. And he made this case in the speech that we have to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine because it's repressing. He used this term genocide. They're carrying out genocide against Russians living within Ukraine. So he concocts these on the face of it, where they have no evidence, he concocts causes for war. So he's still trying to play to the norms of international law and the international community. Months ago, during the buildup, I remember watching a video of this meeting that Putin had with his defense minister and other leading generals. And they were talking about how the United States, his defense minister said, the United States is developing chemical weapons on the territory of Ukraine. And it's like, no, this is not. But they invent these reasons to go to war. And I think that's a good question. And you can see this list of unfriendly countries as, perhaps a step in that direction. Another scholar that I know was making the point that to watch out, or when will it be the case as Putin is becoming more desperate, where he will act against Poland, right? So we'll act against Ukrainian refugees going in and supplies coming to Ukraine from Poland. So that would be a step that you could see happening, and when it does, right, because Poland is a member of NATO, that it could lead to a wider war. But yeah, that was really a good question.
Yeah. Well, the next two questions both have to do with that sort of somber tone of wider war. Again, I'll give you the next two, and you can decide what order to take them in. One is a follow-up from Zach, I think, saying, if Putin's going from precise weapons to vacuum bombs, is nuclear war going to be the likely end stage? And then student John Meyer says, is this going to encourage China to invade Taiwan? So two big worries of slightly different nature, but you want to address one or both of those?
With China, the thing that's been, so the other classes I used to teach were Chinese history. And so I've been watching China, and it's been interesting that China has, even though Chinese television reporters are embedded with Russian units, and so the Chinese are getting something of a Russian version of what's happening. But the Chinese government has distanced itself somewhat from Russia. The lasted evidence of that was the news that came out today that China is not going to provide airplane parts for Russian Russian aircraft, right? So Boeing and other Western, Boeing and I think Airbus have said they're not going to provide any spare parts. And this is, from what I read, this is going to bring a complete halt to air travel in Russia in a matter of weeks if they can't get their hands on spare parts. And now China as well has said, no, we're not going to provide that. There were I read some fascinating tweets by China experts, and some of the fun with China experts is reading the official statements of the Chinese government, and just in small nuances and phrases, they're able to detect, no, this represents that there's a bit of a cooling off between Xi Jinping and Putin. And so I don't think that China is going to act against Taiwan. I think China is recognizing, China needs, for its economic development, to sell stuff to the rest of the world, and principally to the United States and to Europe. And in recognizing how swiftly and completely the United States, Europe, developed countries cut Russia off, I think that will deter China. China doesn't want to go that route of cutting themselves off. So the other question was about the potential nuclear war. Yeah. All right. Hey, it's Thursday night.
Well, you gave us an optimistic answer about China. You want to give us another optimistic answer?
I'll say this. We can't discount that. We can't say that Putin won't do it. So that comes from Fiona Hill, the the expert on Russian affairs, who was targeted by Trump and spoke against him in the first impeachment hearings. But she's as good as it gets when it comes to understanding Putin and understanding Russia, and she's said we can't discount that as a possibility. So yeah.
Jonathan Cooper asks, what would a Russian occupation look like? Would memories of Soviet Afghanistan be strong with you?
It would be awful. It would be, yes. For one, look on the map of the size of Ukraine. It's a huge country. It's, the territory, I saw a photo, where it was the territory was imposed over the map of the United States. So I think it spans from like New York City to Chicago, right? So you have this vast territory that would cover over, pretty much the entire Midwest and Northeast, 50 million people. And the Russian military is already maxed out, right, in terms of the number of their troops. So it would be, there's no way the Russians can occupy the territory of Ukraine. Knowing that, in wondering if Putin was going to launch an attack, I had thought he was going to focus his attack simply on the eastern part of the Ukraine, to have, say, a corridor from Crimea to the Donbass region, or try to take, the eastern part up to the Dnieper River, where Kiev is, and just kind of recognize to leave the West. But I've been surprised at, launching this full-on assault from the north, the east, and the south in Ukraine, and it's just beyond their capacity to carry out an occupation like that. And Russian troops have a bad history as occupiers. They're just they're undisciplined, poor morale, and that plays out in their record of occupation.
So you're not saying they wouldn't attempt it. You're just saying it would be.
I think he wants to do that, right? I think he has it in mind that we will. I think he had it in mind that the Ukrainians would welcome him.
Yeah.
And yes, I think he did have it in mind that they would conquer the country and bring it back into the fold, or at least install a puppet government. But the idea that the Russians could occupy that territory is, that couldn't happen.
Slightly different turn to the next question. Similarities between Putin and Mussolini.
Oh.
Well, similarities, he says, with Italy in the 20s and 30s.
Shirts off. How about that? There's a similarity. And that's key. And that's key because Putin, like Mussolini, wants to show himself as this vigorous man, as this strong leader. And one of my old colleagues did a terrific thread of tweets about, she's a Russian historian, and she pointed out, and this was terrific, the importance of Putin wanting to show himself as a manly man and a manly leader. So remember, go back, Putin became president in 1999. Prior to that, the president was Boris Yeltsin, right, from 1991 till 99. And Yeltsin, in the West, we had this vision of, or this view of Yeltsin as kind of the bumbling, buffoonish drunkard character. And this was the view of him that was held in Russia as well. And when Putin came to power in the late 1990s, this was the period where there was just rampant alcoholism. The life expectancy for Russian males was dropping. And so he has come in and presented himself as this epitome of health and vigor and manliness. So in that respect, it does connect with Mussolini. And I'll go back to what I've, the research I've done on sports. You see this play out in the comments of readers on sports sites, where they have this vision of Russia is tough, Russia is manly, and the West is effeminate, the West is weak. And so I think that's a pretty good question.
We're approaching 9 o'clock, and there's one question left, and it's from Jenna. So I think we'll give Jenna the last question. It's actually 3 questions, and I think you've answered 2 of them, but I'll give you the 3, and you can certainly answer the first and tell us what else you want.
All right.
What can we as individuals and the U.S., NATO, the West do to support Ukraine? Are sanctions working? And is there an off-ramp for Putin?
Are sanctions working? Yes, from what I've seen, there is, and from what I've been reading, ordinary Russians are becoming aware of the consequences and that they're getting cut off from the rest of the world. There are some Russians who say, we don't need the world, who cares? And there are some Russians who say, as I said earlier, yeah, we're kind of in a bad spot thanks to Vova is the Russian nickname for Putin. And I think in the weeks ahead, from what I've been reading, the sanctions will have greater weight. The sanctions, a big part of the sanctions is and how they're working, I would say, is how unprecedented they are, right? Think that the Swiss froze bank accounts, right? Yeah. Did we ever think we would see that? And so, or the Finns sending arms, or the Germans sending arms, right? So there are things that you see happening that, are stunning to me or stunning to others. And I think they've stunned the Russians as well, of the extent of the sanctions and the purpose that the United States and Europe and Canada have. Let's see, is there an off-ramp? The Hague. So the Ukrainians are doing this great practice. The Czechs did this too when the Russians invaded in 1968, of pulling down the road signs, right? So the tank drivers and the truck drivers get lost. And I saw a photograph where Ukrainians had redone a highway sign, so there was an off-ramp, a straight ahead, and another off-ramp, and all the arrows pointed to the Hague, to the International Criminal Court. Yes. Yeah. And then lastly, what can you do? There are so many different organizations that are doing work in Ukraine. I'll tell you what you can do. I've been in contact this week with a Ukrainian acquaintance. He lives here in Minnesota. He's been in the States for 20 years. And I asked, what can I do? And he said, write to your member of Congress and your senator and ask them, for instance, write to your senators and say, tell the Pentagon to allow Poland to transfer the MiG fighters to Ukraine. Poland set up a deal to transfer fighters to the Ukrainian military, and the Pentagon stepped in and nixed the deal. So write letters to members of Congress, to senators, asking them to support Ukraine to the hilt in terms of sanctions and in terms of support. That's something that you can do. There are organizations that are providing a lot of humanitarian aid. What I've heard for aid to Ukraine is what is really needed now are supplies for the military. I've been in contact with a group that has provided just walkie-talkies for the local. You have so many volunteers now, right, coming to join the military that they're kind of outstripping the influx of volunteers is outstripping the supplies that the Ukrainian military has. I've been in contact with someone else. If somebody has connections on how to get helmets and flak jackets from the United States to Europe, somebody's got insights on logistics to Europe, get in contact with me, because I have someone who wants to get helmets and flak jackets into the Ukrainian military. So if anybody's interested, I can put you in touch with an organization that's providing supplies on the ground to the Ukrainian military. So we have a lot of big organizations that are doing work, and there's a lot of what you could call DIY, on the ground, low level actions that are going on, where somebody who lives in a town knows somebody in the local military unit. They go back and forth, they talk about what each other needs, and they kind of look for solutions. And what they need from us is, help getting them stuff and help getting them money. So yeah, that's how you can help. So get in contact with your members of Congress, and yeah, look for places where you can donate.
Yeah, thanks. And of course, with more than 2 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe now, there are lots of organizations, World Renew right here at home, and lots of other charities collecting just to help those refugees. So for folks who don't want to fund helmets or military supplies, there's a lot that we can all do. Bruce, thank you so much. We're a little past 9, so I think it's time to stop. Thank you for all the great questions, everyone. Thanks again to Jennifer.
Thank you, Jenna. Thanks for everybody for coming out.